When we think of the Middle Ages, the first images that often come to mind are of knights clad in shining armor, stone castles rising majestically against the horizon, or perhaps a minstrel playing a slightly off-key tune in a dusty village square, surrounded by curious villagers. But there's something we rarely imagine. The heat. That stifling, relentless heat that turns summer days into a test of human endurance. Because, believe it or not, medieval summers in Europe could be a veritable earthly inferno, with temperatures that, without the blessing of air conditioning, electric fans, or even a humble modern handheld fan, transformed villages into open-air ovens and castles into makeshift saunas. Yet, medieval people weren't the type to sit sweating in silence, lamenting their fate. With a mix of ingenuity, limited resources, and a patience we'd envy today, they developed a series of techniques to combat extreme heat that, though forgotten in our era of technological comforts, deserve recognition for their creativity, practicality, and, in some cases, sheer audacity. Below, we'll explore 10 of these forgotten medieval cooling techniques in detail, uncovering how our ancestors managed to survive days when the sun seemed determined to cook them alive, with a touch of humor that helped them face the situation with some dignity. Let's start with one of the simplest yet no less ingenious strategies: the use of lightweight, strategically designed clothing. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't just a matter of social status or aesthetics. It was, above all, a tool for survival, a shield against the elements. Peasants, artisans, and even the nobility understood that the choice of clothing could make the difference between a tolerable day and one where you felt your skin was about to melt. Fabrics like linen were the holy grail of medieval wardrobes. Derived from the flax plant, linen was lightweight, absorbent, and, most importantly, breathable. Unlike thick wool, ideal for cold winters, linen dried quickly, sparing wearers that sticky, maddening feeling of a sweat-soaked shirt clinging to the body like an unwanted second skin. The process of making linen was labor-intensive. Fibers were extracted from the plant, hand-spun, and woven on rudimentary looms, often by families themselves. The effort was worth it, as a well-made linen tunic could last years and become the best defense against the heat. Cotton, though less common and more expensive due to its importation from distant lands like the Levant or even India, was also highly prized for the same reasons. When available, it was reserved for the wealthy or special occasions, but its rarity didn't diminish its prestige as a summer fabric. Loose-fitting tunics, which to modern eyes might look like sacks with sleeves, were a masterpiece of practical design. Their ample cut allowed air to circulate freely around the body, creating a kind of personal microclimate that kept the heat at bay. These garments didn't cling to the body, unlike armor or winter clothing, but hung loosely, letting even the slightest breeze cool the skin. Peasants often wore knee-length tunics, typically with wide sleeves that could be easily rolled up during fieldwork. Women, meanwhile, wore similar dresses, sometimes with an additional layer of light fabric that could be removed or adjusted based on the temperature. The color of clothing also played a crucial role. While the wealthy could afford to dye their garments in vibrant hues like crimson, indigo, or emerald green, obtained from expensive dyes such as cochineal, woad, or local plants, the more practical, including many peasants, opted for light colors like white, beige, or pale gray. These colors reflected sunlight instead of absorbing it, significantly reducing the sensation of heat. Picture a farmer in a field under the scorching sun, a white tunic fluttering in the breeze, as if saying to the sun, "Not today, friend, not today." Hats, meanwhile, were another essential element. Straw hats, woven from plant fibers like wheat, rye, or even esparto grass, were common among peasants and field workers. These hats not only shielded the head from direct sunlight but also allowed heat to escape through the crown, preventing the brain from turning into a fried egg. Weaving a straw hat was a skill many families mastered, with children often learning from a young age, sitting in the shade of a tree while their hands deftly braided the fibers. Among the upper classes, hats could be more elaborate, adorned with embroidery, ribbons, or even feathers for the more ostentatious, but the principle remained the same: keep the head cool and avoid heat stroke. Women, who often wore veils or headpieces as part of their attire, opted for lighter versions in summer, using translucent fabrics like fine linen or imported muslin that provided shade without trapping heat. Some of these veils were so delicate they seemed to float around the head, giving an almost ethereal appearance, though in reality, they were a practical solution to keep the sun at bay. This attention to detail in clothing wasn't just about comfort. In a world where heat stroke could be deadly, especially for children or the elderly, it was a matter of life and death. But clothing, however clever, wasn't enough when the sun unleashed its full fury. This brings us to the second technique, the use of natural and artificial shade. Medieval people were true masters at leveraging their environment to create cool refuges, demonstrating a connection to nature that we, in our era of glass and steel buildings, have largely forgotten. In villages, broadleaf trees like oaks, chestnuts, lindens, or even walnuts were revered not only for their wood, fruit, or poetic shade, but because they provided dense, cool shade that could lower temperatures by several degrees. These trees, often centuries old, were the medieval equivalent of natural air conditioning. Village squares were frequently designed around a large tree, which became the social heart of the community. Beneath its canopy, villagers gathered to chat, trade, settle disputes, weave, repair tools, or simply rest, grateful for the respite nature provided. In some villages, these trees were so vital they were considered almost sacred, and cutting one down without permission could spark the wrath of the entire community. It wasn't uncommon for elders to tell tales of the great oak that had sheltered generations of villagers from the sun, as if it were a benevolent guardian. In castles and manorial homes, things were a bit more sophisticated but no less ingenious. Nobles had gardens built with climbing vines, pergolas covered with grapevines, climbing roses, or even ivy, creating shaded walkways that looked like something out of a Renaissance painting. These structures were not only aesthetically pleasing but also reduced temperatures by blocking direct sunlight and allowing air to circulate freely. Grapevines, for example, were ideal because their broad leaves created dense shade, while their fruit provided an additional refreshment in the form of fresh grapes. In monastery gardens, monks planted aromatic herbs like lavender or rosemary among the vines, adding a touch of olfactory freshness to the environment. Some castles even had small courtyards designed specifically for summer, with stone benches placed under the shade of pergolas, where nobles could read, converse, or simply enjoy a cool breeze while their servants watered the plants to keep them lush and green. However, not everyone was fortunate enough to have a centuries-old oak, a lordly garden, or a monastic cloister. For the less fortunate, the solution lay in improvisation. In markets, it was common to see awnings made of coarse fabric, like canvas, recycled sacks, or even old blankets, stretched between poles, hung from ropes, or attached to nearby buildings. These awnings not only provided shade but also lowered the ground temperature, which could become so hot that walking barefoot felt like crossing a bed of coals. Merchants, always mindful of their customers' comfort and their own profits, ensured their stalls were as cool as possible. Some went a step further, hanging damp cloths along the edges of awnings or around their stalls. When a breeze passed through these cloths, the water evaporated, naturally cooling the air. This trick was especially popular in southern European markets, where the heat could be so intense that even dogs sought refuge under carts. It was like a primitive air conditioner, no plugs, electric bills, or technicians complaining about a dirty filter required. In homes, villagers used a similar method to stay cool. They hung damp curtains or cloths over windows and doors, letting the breeze do the rest. The process was simple but effective. The cloth was soaked in a bucket of water, lightly wrung out to avoid puddles, and hung in a window facing the wind. As air passed through, the water evaporated, cooling the interior of the house. This method required a steady water supply, meaning someone, usually children or servants, had to make trips to the well or river. But the relief it provided was so welcome that few complained. In hotter regions, like southern Spain, Italy, or southern France, some families took this a step further by sprinkling curtains with herb-scented water, like mint or lavender, for an aromatic touch of freshness. It wasn't exactly a luxury spa, but on a swelteringly unbearable day, it was as close as you could get to feeling like a noble without the price of a castle. The third technique takes water use to a more dynamic and, admittedly, more sophisticated level: moving water. Medieval people didn't have hoses, inflatable pools, or high-pressure showers, but they understood a fundamental physical principle that still holds true today. Moving water cools more than stagnant water. This knowledge didn't come from physics textbooks but from observation and experience. In monasteries and castles, architects designed fountains, channels, and ponds that were not only decorative but also functional. The sound of running water, with its constant gurgling, had an immediate psychological effect, making people feel cooler just by hearing it, as if the brain decided any place with flowing water couldn't be that hot. But the real secret was evaporation, a process medieval people didn't understand scientifically but knew how to exploit masterfully. In monastic cloisters, for instance, small stone channels ran through courtyards, carrying water slowly, often diverted from a nearby stream, spring, or underground well. These channels were carefully designed to maximize air contact. The sun-heated stones absorbed heat, and as water passed over them, it evaporated, drawing even more heat from the surroundings and lowering the air temperature. Some monasteries took this to the extreme, creating systems of channels that snaked through multiple courtyards, ensuring every corner of the building had access to a steady flow of cool air. These systems not only cooled the environment but also kept garden herbs and plants moist, an added benefit for monks growing their own medicinal remedies. It wasn't uncommon for monastery visitors, whether pilgrims or nobles seeking peace, to remark on how pleasantly cool these spaces were, even on the hottest days. Some even joked that the monks must have a secret pact with the heavens to keep their cloisters so refreshing. In castles, fountains were a status symbol but also a practical tool. Wealthy nobles commissioned ornamental fountains in their courtyards, often decorated with sculptures of animals or mythological figures. These fountains not only impressed guests but also cooled the surrounding air, especially if designed to splash or disperse water, increasing evaporation. In some cases, architects installed small jets that sprayed water as a mist, a medieval precursor to modern outdoor misting systems seen at restaurants. Servants, of course, were tasked with keeping these fountains running, which meant hauling water or ensuring channels didn't clog with leaves or mud. It was hard work, but the result was worth it, a cool courtyard where nobles could relax without feeling like they were inside an oven. In humbler homes, where there was no budget for stone channels or ornate fountains, families improvised with what they had. They placed bowls, jugs, or even buckets of water near windows or doors, often adding aromatic herbs like mint, lavender, rosemary, or wild rose petals for an extra touch of freshness. The breeze passing over the water's surface cooled slightly, carrying welcome relief into the house. On the hottest days, it wasn't uncommon for someone to dip a cloth in the bowl and place it on their forehead, neck, or wrists, where veins are closer to the skin. This trick, which we now know as a home remedy for heat, was common in the Middle Ages and worked because evaporating water absorbed body heat. In some villages, women organized soaking shifts, where children kept the bowls filled while adults rested, creating a communal system to combat the heat. It was the medieval equivalent of sticking your head in the freezer, minus the risk of frozen eyebrows or a scolding from grandma for wasting electricity. The fourth technique is one that might surprise us with its simplicity but showcases the practical ingenuity of the era: the use of basements and underground spaces. In the Middle Ages, many homes, castles, and monasteries had basements or cellars dug into the earth, originally designed to store food like grain, wine, beer, cheese, or salted meat. These spaces, insulated by layers of soil, maintained a constant cool temperature, even when the surface turned into an oven. The earth, a few meters deep, acts as a natural insulator, keeping temperatures rarely above 15 degrees Celsius, even on the hottest days. In summer, these cellars became improvised refuges where families could escape the scorching heat. Nobles, with their well-equipped castles, had spacious, well-ventilated cellars, sometimes decorated with tapestries, shelves, or even rudimentary furniture like benches or wooden tables. It wasn't uncommon for them to hold meetings, light banquets, or even naps in these spaces during the hottest hours. Imagine a feudal lord, in his linen tunic, reclining on a cushioned chair in his cellar, sipping cool mead while his servants sweated on the surface, running to fulfill his orders. It was the height of medieval luxury, a way of saying, Let the heat stay outside. I'm in my cool cave. Peasants, on the other hand, didn't have such sophisticated cellars, but many dug small pits under their homes, barely large enough to store provisions. These makeshift basements, often little more than a hole covered with boards or mats, became the favorite spot for resting, chatting, sewing, or storytelling in summer. Building these pits was often a communal effort in villages. Men dug, women prepared food for the workers, and children hauled dirt away in baskets. Once finished, the cellar became a shared treasure, a place where the whole family could take refuge from the heat. Ventilation was key. A poorly ventilated cellar could become a damp, moldy trap, so medieval people ensured small openings, sometimes covered with wooden grills or cloth, allowed air to circulate. In some regions, especially southern Europe, homes were built partially underground, with adobe or stone walls that kept interiors cool. These cave houses, common in areas like southern Spain, southern Italy, or parts of France, were especially prevalent where heat could be relentless. Living in a cave doesn't sound glamorous, but when the alternative was roasting under the sun, it was a more than reasonable choice. Plus, these spaces offered an added benefit: privacy. In a village where everyone knew how many chickens you had or who you argued with at the market, a cool cellar was the perfect place to escape for a while and pretend you didn't hear the neighbor complaining about his cows. The fifth technique takes water use to a more direct and, let's admit, more fun level: cold baths and strategic soaks. Today, taking a cold shower or jumping into a pool seems the obvious solution to heat, but in the Middle Ages, access to clean water wasn't so simple. Bathing wasn't a daily practice for most, and water often had to be fetched from a well, river, or stream, requiring effort, time, and sometimes courage to face mosquitoes or leeches lurking on the banks. However, in summer, rivers, lakes, and streams became gathering spots for cooling off. Their banks filled with villagers who not only washed clothes, fished, or filled buckets but also took the chance to dip their feet, hands, or, for the boldest, their entire bodies. Children, as expected, were the first to plunge in, turning a simple dip into an impromptu party filled with laughter, splashing, and the occasional scolding from adults for dirtying clean clothes. Adults, though more restrained, didn't hold back either. In villages, it wasn't uncommon to see groups of women soaking their feet while gossiping about village affairs or men cooling off after a day in the fields, shedding their tunics and letting the cold water bring them back to life. In monasteries, monks had access to pools or ponds originally designed for hygiene or religious rituals, like foot washing before certain ceremonies. In summer, these ponds became true oases of coolness. Some monasteries even had systems to channel fresh water from nearby springs, ensuring a steady supply for drinking and cooling off. Monks, always mindful of their order's rules, often limited their time in the water, but there's no doubt those moments of immersion were a divine relief, in more ways than one. Nobles, always eager to stand out, sometimes had private baths built in their castles, with wooden, stone, or even metal tubs in the most extravagant cases. These tubs were filled with water hauled by servants, often heated for winter baths but used cold in summer, sometimes straight from the nearest well. But here's the medieval twist that makes this technique particularly fascinating. Not everyone bathed just to cool off. Many believed cold water had healing properties, especially when infused with herbs or salts. It wasn't uncommon to see someone submerged up to their neck in a barrel, with sprigs of rosemary, lavender petals, or even willow bark floating around them, convinced they were fighting both the heat and any ailments lurking in body or soul. In some regions, cold water was thought to balance the hot humors that, according to medieval medicine based on Hippocratic theory, caused illnesses like fevers or inflammations. So, while cooling off, medieval people also believed they were improving their health, giving them a perfect excuse to spend more time in the water, even if it was in a barrel that faintly smelled of herbs and damp wood. The sixth technique combines architecture and common sense: the orientation of buildings. Medieval people didn't have thermometers, architectural design software, or advanced engineering studies, but they had something just as valuable: keen observation of nature. When building homes, churches, monasteries, or castles, they paid attention to details like wind direction, the sun's path, and the terrain's features. Peasant homes, for example, were often oriented so their main windows faced north, where direct sunlight was less intense. This simple choice could lower indoor temperatures by several degrees, making the house habitable even on the hottest days. Thick walls, made of stone, adobe, mud-covered wood, or even straw in poorer regions, acted as natural insulators. During the day, these walls absorbed heat slowly, keeping the interior cool, and at night, they released stored heat, creating a thermal balance that any modern builder on a tight budget would envy. In hotter regions, like southern Europe, walls were often whitewashed with lime, a white material that reflected sunlight and helped keep interiors even cooler. This trick, now associated with the white houses of the Greek islands, was common in the Middle Ages in places like Andalusia or Sicily, where heat could be so intense that even lizards sought shade. In castles, orientation was even more strategic. Main halls, where nobles spent most of their time, were typically on the shaded side of the building, often facing north or east to avoid the scorching afternoon sun. Kitchens, which were hellish due to the constant fires needed to cook for dozens of people, were placed in separate areas, often in a different wing or even a detached building. This prevented kitchen heat from spreading to the rest of the castle, a crucial consideration when the space was already hot. Medieval architects also used tricks like pronounced eaves, which jutted out from the roof to cast shade over walls and windows, reducing heat entry. These eaves, often decorated with wood or stone carvings in wealthier castles, were like a giant built-in parasol, designed to say no thanks to the sun. In churches, the design was even more sophisticated. High windows, typical of Gothic cathedrals, allowed hot air to rise and escape, while cooler air entered through lower doors or small openings near the ground. This cross-ventilation system was so effective that many churches became impromptu refuges during heat waves, with villagers and pilgrims entering not only to pray but also to enjoy a break from the heat. It wasn't a perfect system, but in a world without electricity or fans, it was a feat of ingenuity that made life a bit more bearable. The seventh technique is one that might make us envy medieval people on the hottest days: refreshing drinks. Without refrigerators, ice cubes, or soda machines, medieval people had to get creative to quench their thirst and stay cool. Water was the basis of many drinks, but in an era when well water could come with an unwelcome surprise of bacteria or parasites, it wasn't always the safest choice. That's why many turned to low-alcohol fermented drinks, like light beer, diluted mead, or watered-down wine. These beverages were not only safer because fermentation killed most pathogens but also had a cooling effect, especially when served at room temperature, which in a cool cellar could be surprisingly pleasant. Light beer, known as small beer, was a daily drink for men, women, and even children, as its low alcohol content made it suitable for all. It was brewed from grains like barley or wheat, often flavored with herbs like hops, which also acted as a preservative. In monasteries, monks were true masters of herbal infusions, an art that combined botanical knowledge with a touch of creativity. Plants like mint, fennel, lemon balm, sage, or even chamomile were steeped in water to create drinks that not only quenched thirst but also left a refreshing sensation in the mouth and body. Mint, in particular, was highly valued because its flavor stimulated cold receptors on the tongue, tricking the brain into thinking the temperature was lower than it was. Monks, who often grew their own herbs in monastery gardens, experimented with different combinations, creating infusions that could be sweet, bitter, or even slightly spicy, depending on available ingredients. These drinks were served in clay jugs, which kept liquids cool longer, especially if stored in a cellar or near a shaded window. Nobles, with access to more exotic resources, could afford to import citrus fruits like lemons, oranges, or even limes from the Mediterranean, the Levant, or, in rare cases, farther afield. These fruits, a costly luxury due to transportation expenses, were squeezed into water, sometimes sweetened with honey or sugar, which was beginning to reach Europe through trade with the Arab world. The result was a primitive lemonade that was the height of luxury, a drink that not only refreshed but also impressed banquet guests. In mountainous regions, like the Alps, Pyrenees, or Scottish Highlands, the real treasure was ice. Surprisingly, ice wasn't entirely unknown in the Middle Ages. During winter, medieval people collected snow or ice from mountains and stored it in deep pits, known as ice houses, insulated with layers of straw, sawdust, leather, or even stones. These pits could preserve ice until summer, when it was used to cool drinks, food, or even rooms by placing it in bowls. Transporting ice was laborious. It was wrapped in cloth or straw and carted to castles or wealthy homes. Once there, it was used sparingly, like an edible diamond. Imagine a noble sitting in his hall, sipping water with a chunk of mountain ice while his servants sweated as if forging swords in a smithy. It was a display of ostentation, but also proof that medieval people knew how to treat themselves in the heat. The eighth technique is one of the most curious and practical: wet floors. In humbler homes, where luxuries like fountains, channels, or spacious cellars were absent, medieval people discovered that wetting the floor could make a significant difference. In homes with dirt, stone, or hardened clay floors, common in villages, the process was simple but effective. The floor was swept to remove dust, old straw, or food scraps the chickens hadn't claimed, then sprinkled with water, often using a branch, a soaked rag, or even an old jug with holes in the bottom. The water's evaporation absorbed heat from the floor and air, creating a cooling sensation that could last for hours. This method was especially popular in hotter regions, like southern Spain, Italy, southern France, or even parts of the Balkans, where stone or adobe floors were common. In these regions, homes were often built with slightly raised, sloped floors to allow excess water to drain without pooling, making the process even more efficient. In castles and manorial homes, servants sometimes spread woven mats of rush, straw, or even damp cloth over the floor, serving a dual purpose: cooling the environment and releasing a natural scent that masked less pleasant medieval odors, like sweat, stale food, torch smoke, or the inevitable livestock smell wafting in from outside. These mats were dampened with water, sometimes scented with herbs or flowers, and placed in main halls, corridors, or even bedrooms. It wasn't exactly a lavender air freshener, but in a world without deodorants or aerosols, it was the best they had. In some cases, mats were changed several times a day, especially in wealthier homes, where servants were tasked with keeping them damp and clean. This method required constant effort, as water had to be fetched from a well, river, or stream, and the process repeated multiple times daily to maintain the effect. Yet, on a swelteringly unbearable day, the relief it provided was worth every drop of sweat. In villages, this often became a communal task. Children ran with buckets of water, competing to see who could cool their section of the village fastest, while adults supervised and, in passing, got an accidental splash. In markets, merchants sometimes sprinkled the ground around their stalls to keep customers comfortable, also helping to keep dust at bay, a constant problem on unpaved streets. This method was so common that, in some regions, it was considered a sign of hospitality. A home with a cool, damp floor was one that cared for its inhabitants and visitors. The ninth technique delves into the fascinating world of superstitions and psychology: cooling rituals. Medieval people were deeply religious and superstitious, and extreme heat was often interpreted as divine punishment, an imbalance of humors, a test of faith, or even the work of some mischievous spirit with a penchant for fire. To counter it, they turned to rituals that, while not always physically effective, helped cope with the heat mentally. In many villages, priests organized processions during the hottest days, where participants walked under the sun, ironically, while being sprinkled with holy water. This water, considered sacred, not only cooled the skin but also reassured villagers, who believed they were appeasing an angry god, balancing humors, or warding off heat demons. Processions often followed a specific route, passing key village points like the church, the well, or the central tree, and could include chants, prayers, or even symbolic offerings, like flowers or small branches, left in the water as a plea for relief. The psychological effect was powerful. By focusing on the ritual, people distracted their minds from discomfort, making the heat seem more bearable. In monasteries, monks took this approach further. Some believed that reading religious texts aloud, especially in cool cloisters or near a water channel, could cool the air, as if sacred words had the power to calm both the spirit and the environment. Gregorian chants, with their slow, melodic, almost hypnotic rhythm, had a calming effect that helped monks stay serene, even when the sun seemed intent on turning them into scorched parchment. In some communities, amulets or relics were believed to protect against heat. For example, carrying a polished river stone, a pendant with a mint leaf, or even a small vial of holy water was thought to keep one cool, though the real benefit was likely the confidence these objects inspired. In some cases, village women crafted small cloth sachets filled with dried herbs, like lavender or rosemary, worn around the neck or belt. These sachets not only gave off a pleasant scent but were also believed to ward off evil heat that caused illness. These rituals may seem absurd from our modern perspective, but we shouldn't underestimate them. In a world where heat could be overwhelming and scientific explanations scarce, anything that helped maintain calm, whether holy water, a chant, an amulet, or a whispered prayer under a tree, was a valuable tool. Plus, these activities often took place in churches or monasteries, which, thanks to their thick walls, stone floors, and thoughtful design, were among the coolest places available. The 10th and final technique showcases medieval pragmatism at its finest: strategic scheduling. Medieval people didn't have digital clocks, weather apps, or news reports to tell them the exact temperature or heat index, but they could read the sun better than any modern meteorologist. They observed its position in the sky, the length of shadows, and the intensity of light to determine the best times to work, rest, or socialize. During summer, they adjusted their daily routines to avoid the hottest hours, typically between noon and early afternoon, when the sun was at its peak and the air seemed to shimmer with heat. Peasants began field work at dawn, when the air was still cool, dew covered the grass, and flies hadn't yet decided to make life miserable. They plowed, sowed, harvested, or tended livestock in the early hours, capitalizing on the energy the morning coolness provided. As the sun rose, they slowed down, and by noon, they took a long break, often lasting several hours, to rest in the shade, eat something light, and wait for the heat to subside. This siesta, now associated with laziness or modern Mediterranean cultures, was actually a deeply rooted survival strategy. Families gathered under a tree, in a cellar, on the porch, or in any cool corner they could find, sharing bread, cheese, onions, seasonal fruits like apples or plums, and perhaps a bit of light beer or herb-infused water. No one in their right mind wanted to light a fire to cook soup or roast meat in the middle of summer, so meals were frugal, designed to nourish without adding heat to the body or environment. Children used these breaks to play, though they were often assigned light tasks, like fetching water or watching animals, while adults chatted, repaired tools, or simply closed their eyes for a moment, letting time pass. In villages, these breaks were a time of community. Neighbors gathered, swapped stories, settled minor disputes, or planned the rest of the day's tasks. It was a rhythm of life dictated by the sun, but also by the need to conserve energy in a world where heat could exhaust even the strongest. In castles, nobles followed a similar schedule, though with a touch of elegance. The hottest hours were dedicated to quiet activities, like reading manuscripts, sewing, embroidering, playing chess or rudimentary board games, or even planning the next crusade, tournament, or strategic marriage, hopefully not involving travel to an even hotter desert. Court ladies often gathered in shaded halls, where servants brought cool drinks or improvised fans made of feathers or cloth. Men, meanwhile, might discuss politics or hunting, though on the hottest days, even the bravest knights preferred to stay still rather than sweat inside their armor. Markets also adapted to the heat, opening at dawn or dusk to avoid turning merchants and customers into puddles of sweat. In larger cities, guilds sometimes regulated work hours to protect artisans, ensuring no one had to toil under the midday sun. For example, bakers, already suffering from the heat of their ovens, often kneaded and baked at night, leaving the day for selling bread at the market or resting. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers followed similar patterns, adjusting their schedules to work when the heat was less oppressive. This approach required no advanced technology or costly resources, just common sense, observation, and a willingness to rise before the rooster had time to stretch. Yet, it was surprisingly effective. By avoiding the hottest hours, medieval people not only reduced the risk of heat stroke but also conserved energy for essential tasks, like harvesting, building, or defending the village from occasional bandits. In hotter regions, like the Mediterranean, This schedule was so common it gave rise to traditions that persist today, like the Spanish siesta or the Italian midday break. But even in Northern Europe, where summers could be milder, medieval people knew that working under the midday sun was an invitation to suffering and adjusted their lives accordingly. These 10 techniques, light and strategic clothing, natural and artificial shade, moving water, cool basements, cold baths, building orientation, refreshing drinks, wet floors, cooling rituals, and strategic scheduling, demonstrate that medieval people were far more ingenious than we often give them credit for. They didn't have thermostats, weather apps, electric fans, or lemon ice cream in a cone, but they knew how to observe, experiment, and adapt to the conditions nature imposed. Each technique was the result of centuries of trial and error, of noting what worked and what didn't, and of making the most of available resources, whether a tree, a bucket of water, a handful of herbs, or a bit of common sense. Some of these ideas, like hanging wet cloths or resting in the shade, may seem quaint or even ridiculous from our modern perspective, but we can't deny their effectiveness. After all, they survived summers that would make any of us tremble, and they did so without complaining too much, or at least, that's what the parchments tell us, though we suspect a few curses slipped out under the scorching sun. The next time you're sweating under relentless heat, consider trying one of these medieval techniques. Hang a damp sheet in the window, seek the shade of a large tree, wet a cloth and place it on your forehead, or simply rise at dawn to tackle your tasks before the sun turns the day into a roasting pit. It may not be as effective as turning on the air conditioning or grabbing a cold soda from the fridge, but at least you can say you're channeling the spirit of a medieval peasant, facing the heat with nothing but ingenuity, a bit of patience, and a touch of humor that, like them, will help you keep a cool head, even if the rest of your body is begging for mercy. And who knows, you might find something comforting in returning to the roots, in remembering that, even without technology, humans have always found ways to adapt, survive, and, along the way, laugh a little at our own miseries.